He asked his roommate to pretend to be his wife for one night. She said yes. And by the end of that evening, neither of them could remember what they had been pretending. For 11 months, Mason Reed and Vivian Cross had shared an apartment, shared a kitchen, shared the quiet weight of two very different lives running side by side. He was a single father terrified of making the wrong move. She was a CEO who had built everything she owned from scratch and still went to bed most nights feeling like she wasn't quite enough. One dinner changed everything, but not in the way either of them expected. If this story already has you curious, hit the like button and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now settle in. This one's going to take a while to tell, and it's worth every minute. The dish towel hit the kitchen counter with a damp slap, and Mason Reed stood there staring at his phone like it had personally insulted him. "No," he said out loud to no one. His daughter Lily was in the next room, 6 years old and deeply committed to a cartoon about a dog who ran a bakery, completely unaware that her father was experiencing a minor crisis at 8:47 on a Wednesday evening. The apartment smelled like the pasta he'd overcooked again, slightly too soft, a little too much salt, and the overhead light in the kitchen had been flickering for 3 weeks because Mason kept forgetting to buy a replacement bulb. He read the text again. "Grandma's turning 80. Dinner is Saturday, the 14th. Your Uncle Gerald already confirmed. Your cousin Dana is bringing her husband. We expect you to bring your wife. Mom." Mason set the phone face down on the counter. He picked it up again. He read it a third time, as though the words might rearrange themselves into something more manageable. They did not. The problem was straightforward and also completely his own fault. For the better part of the last year, Mason had been letting his mother believe things that were not entirely true. Not outright lying. He was careful about that, mostly out of some stubborn leftover principle, but allowing her to draw conclusions he hadn't bothered to correct. It had started 8 months ago when his mother called during one of those evenings when Vivian was in the kitchen making tea and Lily was sitting on the counter eating crackers she wasn't supposed to have before dinner. And his mother had asked, in that particular tone she reserved for questions she already thought she knew the answer to, "Is there a woman over there with you?" And Mason had said, "Yeah, she lives here." His mother had made a small sound of satisfaction, the kind of sound that, in retrospect, he should have immediately addressed. Instead, he'd said he had to go and hung up, and over the following months, the story had quietly grown in his mother's imagination without him doing a single thing to water it. He had mentioned Vivian's name twice. He had said, when pressed, that things were good. He had failed to correct the assumption that good and serious meant the same thing. And now his grandmother was turning 80, and his mother had texted the word wife like it was already a settled fact. Mason picked up his phone and typed back, "She has a work thing that weekend. Not sure she can make it." He stared at that for 4 seconds, then deleted it. His mother would not accept a work conflict. His mother had once shown up to his cousin Dana's wedding while running a 101-degree fever because she believed family events were non-negotiable. Full stop. He typed, "I'll check and let you know. Send." He put the phone down and pressed both hands flat on the counter and looked at the ceiling, where the flickering light was doing its thing again, that slow, irregular pulse that made the kitchen look like the opening scene of a horror movie. "You okay?" He turned around. Vivian Cross was standing in the doorway of the kitchen in a faded green sweatshirt and socks with small cartoon cacti on them, holding an empty mug and looking at him the way she sometimes looked at spreadsheets, like she was already calculating what was wrong before he'd said a word. This was the thing about living with Vivian. She paid attention. Not in an intrusive way, not in the way that made you feel observed, but in the quiet way of someone who noticed things and filed them away without making a production of it. Mason had lived with a college roommate once who could not have told you Mason's middle name after 2 years, and he'd lived with an ex-girlfriend who noticed everything and turned every noticing into a conversation about feelings. Vivian was something else. She saw things. And then she waited to see if you wanted to talk about them. "My grandmother's turning 80, Mason said. "That's nice." She moved to the cabinet and got herself a glass. "Why do you look like someone told you your car needs a new engine?" "Because my mother texted me to bring my wife to the birthday dinner." Vivian turned around slowly. She set the glass down on the counter. "Your wife?" My wife. Mason. She tilted her head. You don't have a wife. I'm aware of that. So what have you been telling your mother? Nothing, he said, and then, at her expression, I mean, nothing specific. I mentioned your name a few times, and I didn't correct some things. Vivian was quiet for a moment. The refrigerator hummed. From the living room came the sound of the cartoon dog explaining something about sourdough. How long has your mother thought you were married? Vivian asked. She doesn't think I'm married. She thinks... He stopped. She thinks things are serious. How serious? Wife-level serious. Vivian looked at him for a long moment. Then she poured herself a glass of water, leaned against the counter with her arms crossed, and said, That's quite a hole you've dug. I know. Saturday the 14th? Yeah. She nodded slowly, not saying anything, and Mason watched her face do the thing it did when she was actually thinking. Not performing thinking, not stalling, but genuinely running through something. He'd learned to wait during those moments. Vivian didn't like being interrupted mid-calculation. Who's going to be there? She asked. My mom, my Uncle Gerald, my Aunt Patricia, probably my cousin Donna and her husband, and my grandmother, obviously. He paused. My grandmother she's sharp. She's 80, but she's sharp. She'll notice things. What kind of things? If we don't actually know each other. Vivian looked at him. We've lived together for 11 months, Mason. I know you put too much salt in pasta and forget to replace light bulbs and sing slightly wrong lyrics to songs when you think no one's listening. I think we probably know each other. He felt something loosen in his chest, just slightly. I know you eat crackers over the sink at 11 at night, and you can't sit through action movies, but you've watched every season of that baking competition show twice, and you keep a backup charger in your work bag and a second backup in your desk because you're terrified of your phone dying. 3 backups, she said. There's one in my coat pocket. 3 backups. She was quiet again. Then, this is a bad idea. I know. If your family finds out, I know. And your daughter is going to be there. I know, Viv. She exhaled through her nose, picked up her glass, looked at the flickering light for a second, then at him. You need to buy a new bulb, she said. And yes, I'll go. Mason Reed had not planned to be a single father at 32. He hadn't planned for most of the things that had actually happened to him, which was part of the reason he'd gotten so good at improvising and so bad at long-term thinking. He had a decent job, project manager at a mid-sized construction firm, nothing glamorous but steady. And he had Lily, who was the clearest evidence that something in his life had gone right even when everything around her was going sideways. Lily's mother, Renee, had left when Lily was 18 months old. Not dramatically, not in a storm of shouting and slammed doors, but in the quiet way that was somehow worse, a slow withdrawal that Mason had noticed too late and addressed too poorly. Until one morning Renee had sat across from him at the kitchen table and said, with complete calm, that she thought this had been a mistake and she wanted to go back to Seattle. She had gone back to Seattle. She sent cards on Lily's birthday and Christmas. She called occasionally. She was not a villain in the story. Mason had spent a long time trying to make her one and eventually given up. She was just a person who had made a decision and lived with it. And Lily was old enough now to understand that some kids had moms who lived far away, and she seemed to have arrived at a kind of peace with that which Mason still found slightly miraculous. He had moved into the apartment on Clement Street 14 months ago because he needed 2 bedrooms and a reasonable commute, and something that wasn't the too big apartment he and Renee had shared, which had started to feel like living inside someone else's memory. Vivian Cross had answered his Craigslist ad with the most efficient email he had ever received. No small talk, no biographical narrative, just 2 questions. Is there a washer or dryer in the unit or in the building? And do you care if I work from home some days? He had written back, in unit. I don't care. She had written, I'll take it. When can I see it? He had expected someone who communicated like that to be cold, maybe slightly difficult, the kind of person who left passive-aggressive notes about dish placement. Instead, Vivian had shown up on a Saturday afternoon in a yellow raincoat. shaken his hand like she was closing a business deal, knelt down immediately when Lily came running over and said, "Hi, I'm Vivienne. What's your name?" In a completely normal voice, not the high-pitched performance voice some adults put on around small children, and Lily had told her name and shown her a drawing of a horse, and Vivienne had looked at it seriously and said, "The legs look right. Horses' legs are hard." Lily had decided on the spot that Vivienne was acceptable. Mason had figured she'd be a quiet, self-contained roommate. He hadn't expected to actually like her. But the thing about sharing an apartment with someone, a real apartment, not a college dorm situation, not a temporary arrangement, was that you couldn't stay strangers. Not really. You ate at roughly the same times. You both needed the bathroom in the morning. You heard each other on phone calls, heard when things were going well and when they clearly weren't. Learned each other's habits the way you learn a song that plays in the background often enough. Not by trying, just by being there. By month 3, Mason knew that Vivienne ran her company out of a home office 3 days a week and went into the actual office 2 days a week and hated both arrangements equally. He knew that she'd built cross-design from a spare bedroom and a laptop 6 years ago, and that it now had 22 employees and 3 ongoing contracts with names that showed up in magazines, and that she talked about this matter-of-factly in a way that didn't invite admiration, even though admiration was probably the right response. He knew she called her mother every Sunday and that those calls lasted exactly as long as they needed to, and sometimes she came out of her room afterward looking slightly tired in a specific way that Mason recognized as the particular fatigue of being loved by someone who also made you feel like you weren't quite measuring up. He had never asked about it directly. She had never explained. They had developed an understanding about the difference between knowing things and needing to discuss them. By month 5, Vivienne had started occasionally making 2 cups of coffee in the morning without being asked. By month 7, Mason had started saving the good leftovers for her without thinking about it. Lily had started drawing pictures that included 3 people instead of 2. Mason had noticed all of this and categorized it as nice. This is nice. Don't complicate it. He was good at that. Vivienne seemed good at it too, which was probably why neither of them had said anything about the fact that somewhere in the last 11 months, the arrangement had started feeling like something other than just an arrangement. They had 4 days before Saturday. Vivienne approached the preparation with the same energy she apparently brought to client pitches, which was to say, structured, thorough, and slightly alarming in its efficiency. She sat down across from Mason on Thursday evening with a yellow legal pad. She was one of those people who still used physical notebooks, which Mason found both anachronistic and oddly reassuring, and said, "Okay, tell me what they know and what they think they know. There's a difference, and we need to be clear on it." Mason had said, "My mom knows your name. She knows you live here. She's probably told my grandmother something, and whatever she told my grandmother is the version we're going to get hit with first because that's how my family works." They brief the matriarch and then wait to see if the story matches. Vivienne wrote something down. "When did we supposedly start dating?" "I don't know. My mom filled that in herself." "Then we need to fill it in better than she did, or the story breaks at the first question." She tapped the pen against the pad. "When did I move in?" 14 months ago. "Then let's say we started around month 3 or 4 of the roommate situation. Natural enough, we were already living together, already knew each other. Less convenient to explain than if we'd met elsewhere, but more believable than love at first sight. My grandmother is definitely going to ask how you knew." "How I knew what?" "That you wanted to stay, that it was real." She asks things like that. She likes the moment, the specific thing. When she asks my Uncle Gerald how he knew he loved my Aunt Patricia, he tells this story about watching her change a tire in the rain, and she didn't ask for help. She just did it, and that was it for him. Mason looked at his hands. She likes those stories. Vivienne was quiet for a moment. "What's a true thing?" she said. "What?" "A true thing about living with you. Something I actually noticed that made me think, okay, this person is decent." She said it practically like she was requesting information for a form, not like it meant anything. The story will be easier to tell if some of it is actually true. Mason thought about it. "I don't know. You tell me." "You made Lily breakfast when she was sick, And you didn't wake me up even though it was 5 a.m. and I was awake, and you could tell. You just handled it. She wrote something down. That was month 2. I noticed it. Something shifted in Mason's chest, quiet and uncomfortable. Okay, he said. Then that's part of the story. What did you notice? She asked, still practical, still looking at the yellow pad. That you came home once with something that had gone wrong at work? I don't know what, you didn't say. And you went straight into your room and you were in there for 20 minutes and then you came out and made dinner and just moved on, like you'd decided. He paused. I noticed that you decide things. On purpose. Vivian looked up from the pad. She held his eyes for a moment and then she looked back down. Okay, she said quietly. We can work with that. But Saturday came fast. Lily knew something was different because Lily noticed everything. She had inherited Mason's tendency to observe and Vivi's tendency, apparently, to wait before commenting on what she'd seen. She had watched Mason iron a shirt on Friday night and watched Vivian try on 3 different dresses on Saturday afternoon and finally said, from her position on Vivian's bed where she'd been watching all of this, "Are you guys going somewhere important?" "Your great-grandma's birthday dinner," Mason said, from the doorway. "Why are you nervous?" "I'm not nervous." Lily looked at him with 6-year-old skepticism that was somehow more effective than most adult skepticism Mason had encountered. "You iron your shirt when you're nervous." Vivian, who was holding a dark green dress in front of herself and looking in the mirror, made a small sound that was almost definitely suppressed laughter. Mason chose not to acknowledge it. "Great-grandma's turning 80, he said. "It's a big deal." "Vivi's coming?" Mason looked at Vivian. Vivian looked at Mason. "Yeah," he said. "Vivi's coming." Lily seemed to consider this and then returned to the book she'd been pretending to read, apparently satisfied. They had arranged for Lily to stay with Mason's neighbor, Mrs. Kim, for the evening. A woman in her mid-60s who loved Lily with a ferocity that Mason found slightly overwhelming and Lily found entirely appropriate. He'd explained it to Lily as a grown-up dinner, and Lily had accepted this with the pragmatism of a child who had been raised mostly by someone who was honest about the fact that not everything was going to be fun. He was buttoning his jacket in the hallway when Vivian came out of her room. Mason had seen Vivian in suits before, had seen her dressed for meetings that went well and dressed for meetings that went sideways, had seen her in the ratty green sweatshirt and the cactus socks and the yellow raincoat. He thought he had a pretty complete inventory of Vivian Cross. The dark green dress was not part of the inventory. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't trying to be anything other than what it was. A well-cut dress on a woman who knew how to wear things that fit her actual body instead of the body someone else thought she should have. But it was the first time in 11 months that Mason had looked at his roommate and felt the specific sensation of not knowing what to do with his hands. "What?" Vivian said, reading his face. "Nothing. You look—" He stopped. "Mason." "Good. You look good. We should go." She looked at him for one more second, and then she picked up her small bag from the console table and said, "Do you want to go over the timeline in the car?" "Yeah," he said. In the car. His mother lived 40 minutes north, in the house where Mason had grown up. A wide, single-story ranch house with a rose garden that had seen better decades and a kitchen that had been renovated in 2009 and not touched since. His grandmother, Eleanor Reed, had been staying with his mother for the past 2 years, ever since Eleanor had decided, at 78, that she was not going to pretend she didn't get lonely in the house she'd lived in for 40 years, and that admitting this was not weakness, but efficiency. Eleanor had run a tailoring shop for 35 years. She had very little patience for inefficiency. Mason pulled up in front of the house and sat in the car for a moment after he turned off the engine. The lights were on inside. He could see movement through the front window. His Uncle Gerald's car was in the driveway. "Okay," he said. "Okay," Vivian said. "We met when you answered the ad. We started around month 3. The breakfast story is how you knew. The deciding story is how I knew. I remember. My grandmother is going to look at you first and then look at me and then look at you again. That's just how she reads a room. I work with boards of directors and venture partners, Mason. I can handle a grandmother. She's not like..." He stopped. She's not like most grandmothers. Okay. She's like if a grandmother had a law degree and also X-ray vision. Vivian picked up her bag. Let's go. The front door opened before they made it up the porch steps, because of course it did. Because his mother had been watching the driveway for the last 20 minutes, Mason would bet money on it. Mason, his mother, Linda Reed, 58, approximately 5'2", and operating at the energy level of someone significantly taller, stepped onto the porch and held out her arms. She hugged him quickly and then, before he could say anything, turned to Vivian with an expression that Mason could only describe as relieved and immediately approving. "Vivian," his mother said, and her voice had that warmth that Mason had grown up associating with people she genuinely wanted to be there, as opposed to the slightly different warmth she used for people she was being polite to. "I'm so glad you could make it." "Thank you for having me, Mrs. Reed." Vivian shook her hand, then seemed to make a decision and accepted the hug his mother offered instead. "I've heard a lot about the birthday. Mason's been excited." Mason, who had not expressed excitement to anyone, managed not to react. Come in, come in. Gerald and Patricia are already here. Dana's running late, as usual." His mother ushered them through the door, one hand briefly touching Vivian's arm in the way she touched people she liked, and Mason followed, and the door closed behind them. The house smelled like it always smelled. The particular combination of the specific cleaning product his mother had used for 30 years, something cooking, the faint background note of the rose garden coming through the windows. Mason always felt, walking through this door, the complicated mixture of comfort and pressure that came from a place that had known you before you knew yourself. His Uncle Gerald appeared from the living room, broad-shouldered, white-bearded, with the handshake of a man who had learned handshakes in an era when they meant something. "Mason, this must be Vivian." He turned to her with the kind of direct attention that Gerald applied to everything. "Gerald Reed, I've heard some things." "All exaggerated, I'm sure," Vivian said, shaking his hand, and Gerald laughed, and said, "I like her already." His Aunt Patricia appeared. His cousin Dana called from the kitchen that she was almost there. His mother was taking their coats, and Mason was standing in the middle of the entrance hallway of his childhood home, watching Vivian move through it like she had always known the layout, and he felt something he could not immediately name. Then the hallway went quiet. Eleanor Reed was standing in the doorway from the living room. She was 80 years old as of today. She was approximately 5'1", and she moved carefully now with the deliberateness of someone who had stopped pretending time didn't affect her. But her eyes were the same they had always been, bright and dark and missing nothing. She looked at Vivian first, then at Mason, then at Vivian again. Mason held very still. "You must be the woman my grandson has been too quiet about," Eleanor said. Her voice had always been like that, dry without being unkind, precise without being cold. Vivian stepped forward. "Vivian Cross, it's a real pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Reed. Happy birthday." Eleanor looked at the hand Vivian offered, then looked at Vivian's face, and then, instead of shaking the hand, she reached out and patted it, which Mason knew from 47 years of experience meant, "I've decided you're real and I approve." "Come sit with me," Eleanor said. "I want to hear how you ended up with my grandson. He's never been easy to get information out of." Vivian glanced at Mason, just a flick of the eyes, quick and steady. "He's worth the patience," she said, and followed Eleanor into the living room. The dinner was long, in the way that his family's gatherings were always long, not because anyone dragged it out on purpose, but because every conversation opened a door to 3 other conversations, because his Uncle Gerald could not tell a short story on principle, because his mother kept getting up to check on things in the kitchen even after everything was already done, because Eleanor asked questions that required actual answers, and she waited until she got them. Mason had been to 100 dinners in this house. He could not have told you, watching Vivian from across the table as she listened to Gerald's story about the fishing trip of 1987, why this one felt different. Maybe it was the way she listened, not performing interest, actually paying attention, asking the follow-up that proved she'd heard the detail, laughing at the part of the story that was actually funny, instead of a half beat early like people did when they were waiting for a signal. She ate the food and said it was good and meant it. When his Aunt Patricia talked about the garden, at length, in detail, possibly more detail than Patricia knew anyone wanted, Vivian asked about the roses specifically, and Patricia lit up, and Mason watched his aunt talk about growing things to someone who was genuinely listening, and something tightened in his throat that he could not account for. "She's good," his cousin Dana said, appearing next to him in the kitchen doorway where Mason had gone to refill the water pitcher. "She's just, Mason stopped. "She's just being herself." Dana looked at him with the particular expression of someone who had known him since he was 9 years old. "Right," she said. "Which is interesting since you've never introduced yourself to any of us before." "I introduce people." "You introduced Renee to us at a family barbecue and said, and I quote, 'This is Renee. She came.' You didn't even say she was your girlfriend." "That was different." Dana took a piece of bread off the counter. "Different how?" Mason did not have an answer for that, which was itself an answer, which Dana could clearly see, because she smiled in a way that was not entirely kind and went back to the dining room. Across the table, Vivian was looking at a photograph his mother had brought out, family pictures, the kind that always came out at these dinners. And she was listening to Eleanor talk about the person in the photo, and she was nodding, and then she looked up and across the table and found Mason watching her. She didn't look away. He didn't look away. Something passed between them that Mason could not have described if he'd tried, and he'd already been trying in the back of his head for most of the evening. He looked away first. He picked up the water pitcher. He thought, "Don't." Eleanor cornered him on the back porch after dinner. She had always done this, found him in the in-between spaces of family gatherings, the moments where the group was loud enough that no one noticed the absence of two people. When he was 12, she had found him out here to talk about his father, who had died the year before. When he was 26, she had found him out here to say, without preamble, that Renee seemed like a woman who needed something Mason wasn't sure he could give her, and that she wasn't saying this to be cruel, only because she had been watching people for 80 years and she thought he should know. He had not listened. He was 26. Now she stood next to him on the porch and looked out at the dark shape of the garden and said, "She's good with you." "We've been living together for almost a year," Mason said. "We know each other." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. The sounds from inside filtered through the screen door. Laughter, his uncle's voice, the clink of glasses. "That's not what I mean," she said. Mason kept his eyes on the garden. "I'm not asking you to explain it to me," Eleanor continued. "I've been watching people my whole life. You don't have to explain it. But I want to say something before we go back inside." He waited. "There is a kind of fear that looks a lot like caution," Eleanor said. "And it's very reasonable seeming. It looks like responsibility. It looks like not wanting to make a mistake, especially when you have a child." She paused. "I'm not telling you what to do. I've never believed that was my business, but I know what it looks like when a person has found someone and won't let themselves know it yet." Mason's chest was doing something complicated. "Mom already tells you everything I do," he said. "Your mother tells me a version of everything," Eleanor said. "I fill in the rest. I always have." She patted his arm, the same gesture she'd given Vivian's hand, and turned toward the screen door. "Come back inside. Your Aunt Patricia is about to start on the zucchini she's growing, and she will be significantly less interesting to your young lady than she was the first time." She went inside. Mason stood on the porch for another minute, listening to the night. The neighborhood quiet, a car somewhere, the muffled warmth of his family through the glass. He thought about the breakfast Vivian had mentioned, the 5 a.m., the sick kid, the way he'd just handled it. He thought about her saying, "I noticed it." He thought about the way she'd looked at him across the table, and how he hadn't looked away, and why he'd eventually looked away, and what the answer to Dana's question would have been if he'd been willing to say it. He went inside. It was late when they finally left, later than Mason had planned, because his family did not believe in early endings, and Eleanor had wanted to hear the rest of the story about how Cross Design had won the contract that made Vivian's company real, and Vivian had told it without embellishment, the 3 months of pitching, the weekend she'd rewritten the entire presentation on a hunch, the moment she'd stood in a conference room and thought, for 1 second, that she might not be enough for this, and then decided she was going to be anyway. That decision, Eleanor had said. Where does it come from? Vivian had thought about it. Deciding I could be wrong didn't feel like an option, she'd said. So I just didn't. Eleanor had looked at her for a moment with something that was not quite a smile and not quite satisfaction, but somewhere between the two. She had not said anything. She had not needed to. Mason's mother hugged Vivian on the way out, the real kind, both arms, and said, I hope we'll see you at Christmas. And Vivian had said, I'd like that. And Mason had been looking at the door frame and not at either of their faces. The drive back was quiet for the first 20 minutes. Then Vivian said, Your grandmother knows. I know. She's known for a while, I think, possibly longer than either of us. Mason kept his eyes on the road. The highway was mostly empty at this hour, just taillights ahead and the occasional sweep of headlights coming the other way. She's observant, he said. She's more than observant. Vivian shifted in her seat, turning slightly toward him. She told me when your Uncle Gerald went to get more wine, she said, he doesn't bring women home. He brought you home 11 months ago. Mason was quiet. She wasn't asking, Vivian said. She was just saying. What did you say? I said that I'd noticed he didn't bring people home, that I'd thought about what it meant. A pause. She seemed satisfied with that. They were off the highway now, on the surface streets, the familiar grid of their neighborhood opening up around them. The streetlights made Vivian's face look something between the version of herself Mason knew in daylight and the version he knew in the evenings when the apartment went quiet and they'd sometimes stay up later than they meant to, talking about nothing specific, just talking. He pulled into the parking space in front of their building and turned off the engine. They sat in the car. Did it feel like acting? Vivian asked. Mason looked at the steering wheel. No, he said. Me neither. He turned and looked at her. She was already looking at him. This time neither of them looked away, and the quiet in the car was not the comfortable background quiet of their apartment, but something else. Something that was asking a question Mason had been not answering for longer than he wanted to count. Vivian, he said. Yeah. He couldn't find the sentence. He knew what he wanted to say, and he could not find the architecture of it. The way to say, I think this stopped being just an arrangement somewhere along the way without it sounding like everything he'd been trained to be careful about. He stopped. She was looking at him with that expression she had, the one where she was waiting, not pushing, just waiting. Come on, she said quietly. Let's go inside. We can figure it out in the kitchen. She got out of the car. Mason sat for one more second, alone in the dark, with the feeling of someone standing at the edge of something and looking down and knowing, finally knowing, that it wasn't as far as he'd told himself it was. Then he got out of the car and followed her. The kitchen light was on when they got upstairs, the way it always was when Mason forgot to turn it off before they left, which was every single time. He'd meant to get one of those smart bulbs that you could control from your phone, and he'd been meaning to do that for about 8 months. The flickering bulb in the overhead fixture had finally been replaced. Vivian had bought one on a Tuesday 2 weeks ago without saying anything, and Mason had come home to a non-flickering kitchen and understood this was how she handled things that bothered her. But the light above the sink was still too bright and made everything look slightly clinical at this hour, like the kitchen was asking serious questions. Vivian set her bag on the counter. She stepped out of her shoes. She always did this just inside the door, both shoes off in one efficient motion, and went to fill a glass of water, and Mason stood in the middle of the kitchen in his jacket, not quite ready to take it off, as though removing it would mean committing to something. Sit down, she said, without turning around. He sat. She came and sat across from him, the way they sat most evenings when they ended up at the kitchen table without planning to, and she wrapped both hands around the glass and looked at him. Say what you were going to say in the car, she said. I don't know how to say it without it sounding... He stopped. Sounding like what? Like I'm making it into something it might not be. Vivian was quiet for a moment. Outside, a car passed on the street below. Somewhere in the building, a door closed. The apartment was exactly as they'd left it. Lily's drawing still on the refrigerator, a stack of Vivian's work folders on the end of the counter, Mason's keys in the bowl by the door, and it struck him, sitting here in his jacket at midnight, that this place looked more like a home than anywhere he had lived since he was a child in his mother's house. He hadn't thought about it that consciously before. He was thinking about it now. After Renee left, he said, and then stopped, because he didn't usually start sentences this way. He didn't usually start them at all, on this particular subject. But Vivian just waited, glass between her hands, and the kitchen was quiet. After Renee left, I spent about a year being angry, and then about 6 months deciding I was fine. And then I made things work. Me and Lily, we got a system, and the system worked, and I was careful about the system, because it had to work, because she's 6 and she's counting on it working. I know, Vivian said. What I mean is, I got careful about everything, about letting things in that could disrupt the system. And I'm a disruption risk. No. He looked at her directly. That's the thing. You're not. You've been the opposite of that. You fit. You fit into our life in a way that I didn't plan for and didn't know what to do with. And so I just let it be what it was, told myself it was enough. Vivian set the glass down. And now I'm sitting in our kitchen at midnight, and you just spent an evening convincing my grandmother's entire side of the family that you love me, and none of it felt like a lie. The word landed in the room, and neither of them moved. I didn't say that, Vivian said carefully. You said you'd like to come for Christmas. A pause. I said it to your mother. I know. He looked at his hands on the table. You meant it. She didn't answer right away. That was its own kind of answer. I've been careful too, she said finally. For different reasons, but the same. The same result. Keeping things where they were. She turned the glass slowly in her hands. It's a good life here. It works. I didn't want to be the one who broke it. Why would you break it? She looked up, and there was something in her face that Mason recognized because he had seen it the night she talked about the conference room pitch. That moment where she'd said, "For 1 second I thought I might not be enough." And the way she'd said it told him it wasn't just the 1 second, and it wasn't just that pitch. Because wanting something more is how you ruin what you already have, she said. I've been good at that, historically. Vivian, I'm not looking for reassurance, she said, and her voice was matter-of-fact in the way it got when she was being very deliberately honest. I'm explaining why I didn't say anything, why I let us keep being what we were, even after it started being... She stopped. Even after it started being what? Mason asked. She looked at him, and then she said quietly and without any particular drama, the best part of my day. Most days, coming home and you being here, Lily drawing pictures, the cooking even when it's bad, which it often is. The salt thing is a genuine mystery to me. I don't know what happens. It's always too much salt, Mason. Every time. I don't understand it either. They both stopped. And then Vivian made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and an exhale, and Mason felt something in his chest unlock in a way he hadn't realized it had been locked. I don't know how to do this, he said. I want to be honest about that. I know how to be your roommate. I know how to be Lily's dad. I don't know how to be... He gestured vaguely at the space between them. Neither do I, she said. I'm not particularly good at relationships. I run a company better than I've ever run anything involving my own feelings. You seemed pretty good at it tonight. Tonight was different. Tonight She thought about it. Tonight I wasn't performing anything. I was just there. With your family. With you. She looked at the table. It was the easiest room I've been in for a long time. Mason reached across the table. He set his hand over hers where it rested next to the glass. It was a simple thing, not a gesture that meant everything all at once, but Vivian looked down at it and then up at him, and something settled in her face. Something that had been held at a particular tension, carefully maintained, finally let go. Okay, he said. We don't have to figure out all of it tonight. No, she agreed. But I don't want to go back to pretending this is just an arrangement. She turned her hand over under his slowly. No, she said. Me neither. They sat like that for a while. Not saying much, not making plans, just sitting in the kitchen at midnight the way they had sat dozens of times before, except that this time neither of them was pretending the silence was only silence. Eventually, Mason said, "Lily's at Mrs. Kim's until 9 tomorrow." "I know." "We should probably sleep." "Probably." She didn't move. "What did your grandmother say to you on the porch?" He thought about it. "She said there's a kind of fear that looks like caution, that looks like responsibility." He paused. "She wasn't wrong." Vivian was quiet. Then, "She told me something too. When I came to find you and you weren't back inside yet, she was in the living room looking at the photographs on the wall, the old ones, her wedding pictures. And she said, without turning around, that she had spent 43 years with a man who was difficult and funny and not easy to love, and that she had never once wished he were simpler." Mason looked at her. "She wasn't talking about you," Vivian said. "She was just talking, but I heard it." He squeezed her hand once. She squeezed back. "Get some sleep," she said. "We can be badly adjusted and uncertain about this tomorrow, too. We don't have to solve it tonight." "That's actually comforting." "I know, I'm practical." She got up, picked up her shoes, and headed down the hallway. At the door to her room, she paused and looked back. "Mason." "Yeah." "For what it's worth, tonight didn't feel like pretending, not for 1 minute of it." She went into her room. The door didn't close all the way, which it never did because the frame had shifted over the years and the latch didn't catch cleanly, just rested partly open in the way that Mason had stopped noticing months ago because it was just how that door was. He sat at the kitchen table a little longer, alone, and he thought about his grandmother on the porch and Donna in the doorway and Vivian at dinner with his family, like she'd been there for years. He thought about the moment across the table when she'd found him watching her and hadn't looked away. He thought about 11 months of coffee and leftover pasta and late nights and the gradual, unremarkable accumulation of knowing another person better than you meant to, so slowly you couldn't point to where it had started. He got up and turned off the kitchen light. In the dark, the apartment felt like itself, small and imperfect, and theirs in a way that had nothing to do with the lease and everything to do with the unremarkable daily fact of two people choosing, without making a production of it, to share a life. He went to bed. He did not sleep for a long time. Sunday morning arrived with the particular quality that Sundays had in this apartment. Later light, softer sound, the city on a different setting. Mason was up first, the way he usually was, and he made coffee, the way he usually did, and he stood at the kitchen window looking out at the street below, and everything was physically identical to 100 Sunday mornings before this one, and also entirely different in some way he couldn't fully describe. Vivian's door was still mostly closed when he heard her moving around in there, the creak of her floor, water running in the bathroom. He had the cup waiting for her when she came out, the way he usually did, and she came to the kitchen in the green sweatshirt and the cactus socks, and she picked up the cup and looked at him over the rim of it. "Hi," she said. "Hi," he said. They looked at each other for a moment, and then she leaned against the counter and drank her coffee, and he turned back to the window, and neither of them needed to do the work of explaining where they were because they both already knew. Something had shifted. They both knew what had shifted. They didn't need to stand in the kitchen and formally announce it to each other. That was not how either of them worked. After a while, she said, "What did you tell your mother about us?" "I haven't told her anything. She's going to call today." "I know." "You should call her first," Vivian said, "on your terms." He had already thought this. It was still easier to hear her say it than to just think it himself. "What do I say?" he asked. Vivian was quiet, considering. "The truth, as much as you can. That things developed. That last night was real." She turned the cup in her hands. "You don't have to explain all of it, but don't backtrack on last night. It'll confuse her and it'll make things harder. My mother's going to start planning things. Probably. She's going to call Eleanor immediately." "She may have already called Eleanor." Mason exhaled. "Eleanor is going to be very satisfied." Vivian's mouth did the thing it did when she was keeping a smile at a controlled level. "Yes," she said. "I think she's going to be extremely satisfied and completely unsurprised." He went to get Lily at 9. Mrs. Kim opened the door before he knocked, because she'd heard him on the stairs, and Lily came running out in a shirt Mason didn't remember packing, which meant Mrs. Kim had dressed her this morning in something from the small collection of clothes Lily had left at Mrs. Kim's over the preceding months, which said something about how often Lily had slept over. "She ate 2 waffles," Mrs. Kim reported, "and showed me her new drawing, the one with the 3 people. 3 people, Mason repeated. "She said it's her family," Mrs. Kim said, with the careful neutrality of a woman who had raised 4 children and knew the value of not making things into a bigger deal than children needed them to be. Mason thanked her and took Lily's hand, and they walked back downstairs together. "Was Vivi still home?" Lily asked. "Yeah, she made coffee." "Did you guys have a good time at Great-Grandma's?" "Yeah, Bug. It was a good time." Lily seemed to accept this. Then, "Did Great-Grandma like Vivi?" Mason held the door to the building open for her. "Yeah, she really did." "Good," Lily said, with the conviction of someone who had already decided this was the correct outcome. "Vivi's the best." She ran up the stairs ahead of him. The call from his mother came at 11:15, not noon, which meant she had exercised approximately 90 minutes of restraint and considered this sufficient. Mason took it on the couch while Vivian and Lily were at the kitchen table, Lily working on a drawing with enormous concentration, and Vivian half watching her while going through something on her laptop, the Sunday version of what their apartment looked like when no one was trying to look like anything. "She's wonderful," his mother said without preamble. "She's just... Mason, she's wonderful. Your grandmother hasn't stopped talking about her." "I know," he said. "She fit in like she'd been there the whole time. Gerald loves her. You know, Gerald is hard to win over. Gerald loved her in about 4 minutes. I watched it happen." "Because she's genuine," his mother said. "You can tell. She's not performing." A pause. "You're happy?" Mason looked at Vivian across the room. She was saying something quiet to Lily about the drawing. He couldn't hear what, but Lily was nodding with the intense nod of someone taking instructions seriously and then adjusting her crayon grip. "Yeah," he said. "I'm happy." His mother made the sound, the satisfied sound, the one he had failed to correct 8 months ago and was now, somehow, extremely grateful for. "Christmas," she said. "She's coming for Christmas. I'm not taking no for an answer." "I'll ask her." "Tell her." "Mom, tell her from me," his mother said, "that she's expected." He said he would. They talked for another 20 minutes about other things. His Uncle Gerald's retirement, his cousin Dana's house renovations, Eleanor's health, which was good, which was the thing the whole family monitored with quiet collective vigilance, the way you watch something precious that you know won't last forever. When they hung up, Mason sat on the couch and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then Lily appeared at his elbow. "Vivi wants to know if you want pancakes," Lily announced. "She says she's making them regardless, but she wants to know if you want them as a matter of basic courtesy. Those are her exact words." "Tell her yes," Mason said. Lily turned and shouted this information toward the kitchen at a volume entirely unsuited to a distance of 12 feet. "I could hear him," Vivian called back, and there was the sound of a cabinet opening. Lily went back to the kitchen. Mason got up from the couch and followed her, because this was where he was. This was where his life was. Not in the careful, managed distance he'd been keeping from it, but here, in the Sunday morning mess of his own apartment, in the kitchen that smelled like coffee, with his daughter, and the woman who had been, for 11 months, the quiet center of something he hadn't had a name for. He came to stand next to Vivian at the stove, not touching, just near, in the way they had existed near each other for a year. She was measuring flour with the careful attention she gave anything she was going to do correctly, and she didn't look up when he came to stand beside her, but she shifted slightly, making room. "My mom says you're expected at Christmas," he said. She leveled off the flour. "Am I?" "She said to tell you, not ask." Vivian was quiet for a moment. Then she picked up the measuring cup and set it down and turned to look at him, and she was close enough that he could see the slight crease from her pillow that was still on her cheek, and the fact of this ordinary detail, this perfectly normal, mundane Sunday morning detail, did something to Mason that all the careful managing of feelings had been trying to prevent. "Okay," she said. "Christmas." Okay. She turned back to the bowl. He stayed where he was, next to her, neither of them making a performance of it, and Lily sat on the counter eating crackers she wasn't supposed to have before pancakes and told them both about what Mrs. Kim's cat had done yesterday in extensive and largely incoherent detail. And the morning went on, Sunday, and ordinary and entirely, quietly changed. The week that followed was not a movie. Mason had braced himself for some version of things being awkward. The first shared morning after a change in understanding between two people who lived together had the potential to be genuinely uncomfortable. But what actually happened was closer to, mostly the same, slightly warmer. They still moved around each other in the kitchen the way they always had. Vivian still left her coffee cup in the left side of the sink, which had always mildly bothered Mason. And Mason still forgot to replace the grocery list on the refrigerator when he used the last item on it, which Vivian had mentioned approximately once and then decided was not a battle worth fighting. These things did not change. What changed was smaller and harder to describe. The way the goodnight at the end of the hallway lasted a moment longer than it used to, the way she looked up from her laptop when he came home, and then actually looked, not just the automatic glance of cohabitation. The way he found himself telling her things during dinner that he would previously have considered too minor to bother with and understanding. Slowly, that the reason he'd considered them minor was that he'd been telling himself she wouldn't be interested, and the reason he'd been telling himself that was that it had felt safer than believing she would be. On Wednesday, Vivian had a client pitch that went sideways in a way that she explained flatly over leftovers. The client had moved the timeline. The contract terms had shifted in a direction that made the project less profitable than it had appeared, and she had spent the afternoon in her office on the phone managing the fallout in a way that she described as tedious and probably fine, but still tedious. And Mason had listened and asked 2 questions and then said, "Do you want to just watch the baking show?" She had looked at him. "You hate the baking show." "I don't hate it." "You said the technical challenges give you stress hives." "I said they were stressful. That's different." He picked up the remote. "Do you want to watch it or not?" She had watched him for a moment in that way she did, the calculation happening visibly behind her eyes, and then she had said, "Yes," and moved from her end of the couch to a position that was closer to the middle, and they had watched the baking show, and Mason had in fact found the technical challenge segment mildly stressful, and at some point in the second episode, Vivian had fallen asleep sitting up with her shoulder against his, and he had not moved. He had sat very still, watching people ice cakes on television, with his shoulder warm where hers rested against it, and he had thought about what his grandmother had said about a man who was difficult and funny and not easy to love. And he had thought about 11 months, and he had thought about the fact that fear dressed up as caution still kept you from things. He turned off the television when the episode ended. "Viv." She startled awake. The immediate full consciousness returned that people who work too hard usually had. No slow emergence, just suddenly present. "Sorry," she said. "Don't be." She straightened up, pushed her hair back, looked at the blank TV, then she looked at him. The apartment was dark except for the lamp, and she looked tired in the way she looked when she'd stopped performing Capable for a while. "It's late," she said. "Yeah." She stood up. He stood up. They were close in the small space between the couch and the coffee table, closer than they usually stood, and neither of them stepped back. "Mason," she said. "Yeah." She reached up, slowly and without drama, and put her hand against the side of his face. Just that, steady and deliberate, the way she did everything she'd decided to do. Her thumb moved once across his cheekbone, and then she dropped her hand. "Okay," she said quietly. Not explaining it, not making it into more than it was yet, just acknowledging it. "Okay," he said. She went to bed. He stood in the living room for a moment, in the dark, and pressed his hand briefly to the side of his face where hers had been. Then he went to bed too. The thing about deciding something quietly, between 2 people in a living room at midnight, is that the rest of the world doesn't get the memo. Monday morning arrived with a full calendar and a broken coffee maker. The carafe had a crack Mason hadn't noticed until he pressed the brew button and came back 10 minutes later to find a slow brown puddle spreading across the counter. Vivian stood in the doorway of the kitchen in her work clothes. She had a client meeting downtown, the real office day. Looking at the coffee situation with an expression of profound personal offense. "That's not okay," she said. "I see that. I need coffee before I can function at the level that meeting requires. There's a place downstairs." "The place downstairs takes 12 minutes. I have 9 minutes." Mason grabbed a dish towel and started on the counter. "There might be instant somewhere, back of the cabinet." "I don't drink instant." "Today might be a day for new experiences." She stared at him. He kept wiping the counter. She turned and went back down the hallway and came out 2 minutes later with her bag and her coat and stopped in the kitchen doorway again. "This is a bad omen. It's a broken coffee maker." "Same thing, 8 a.m. on a Monday." She adjusted her bag on her shoulder. "There's instant in the back of the cabinet, left side, behind the protein powder you bought and never used." "How do you know that?" "Because I live here and I notice things." She was already moving toward the door. "The meeting's at 10. I'll probably be back by 2. Don't throw away the coffee maker. I want to see if it's fixable." "It's not fixable, Vivian. It's cracked." The door closed. Mason stood in the kitchen holding the damp towel, looking at the door. He was aware that he was smiling, slightly, for no reason a neutral observer would have been able to identify. He stopped doing that and went to find the instant coffee pot. The thing that nobody told you about beginning something with someone you already lived with was that there was no beginning. There was no first date with its careful presentation of best qualities, no getting to know you stage, no period of maintained mystery. What there was instead was the full unedited reality of another person. Every ordinary flaw already in view, every bad habit already documented, and the terrifying and also clarifying knowledge that they had seen all of it and were still here. Mason found this more frightening than a beginning would have been. A beginning had exits built in. This had no exits he hadn't already tried to find and given up on, and that was the thing he kept turning over during the week. Not the warmth of it, not the Wednesday night on the couch that he kept returning to, but the exposure of it. The fact that Vivian Cross knew he sang wrong lyrics to songs and put too much salt in everything and had spent a year being careful about nothing actually changing, and she was choosing this anyway. He didn't know what to do with being chosen by someone who had full information. He called his sister on Thursday. Clara, 35, lived in Portland, the one member of his family he could talk to without the conversation becoming a family meeting. Clara picked up on the third ring and said, "I heard about the dinner. Mom called me approximately 47 seconds after you left." Of course she did. She said Vivian is wonderful and Eleanor approved, and Gerald told Patricia she seemed like real people, which from Gerald is basically a standing ovation. Clara paused. "So, are you panicking?" "I'm not panicking." "Mason, I'm processing." "Same thing with you," Clara said. "What's the specific fear?" He thought about it. Outside his office window, the city was doing its midday thing. Traffic, delivery trucks, the usual urban friction that he had stopped noticing years ago. "That I get this wrong," he said. "That I let it be real, and then I get it wrong, and then I don't just lose the relationship, I lose—" He stopped. "The whole setup," Clara said. "Yeah. Lily's already attached." "I know. Vivian already functions as, I know, Clara." She was quiet for a moment. "Can I say something that's going to annoy you?" "You're going to say it regardless." "You've been getting it right for 11 months, she said. "Whatever you've been doing, the roommate thing, the friendship, the whatever you're calling it, it's been working. Lily's happy. Vivian's still there. You haven't blown it. So maybe the question isn't whether you'll get it wrong. Maybe the question is why you think changing the label changes the foundation." Mason looked at the window. "When did you get smart?" "I've always been smart. You just don't call me enough." She paused. "Does she know you're scared?" "She's scared too." "Okay, but does she know you know she's scared?" He didn't answer right away. "Call her," Claire said. "Not me. I'm flattered, but wrong audience." He said he would. He meant it. He sat at his desk for another 40 minutes, finishing a project report, and thought about what his sister had said. The label doesn't change the foundation. And turned it over the way you turned over something that you knew was probably right, but that you weren't ready to fully agree with yet. Vivian had her own version of the same fear, and it lived in a different room of her head than Mason's did. Hers was not about getting it wrong in the tactical sense. She had made mistakes in relationships before. One serious one, in her mid-20s, with a man she'd met at an industry conference who had seemed for about 14 months like someone who genuinely saw her and had turned out to see a version of her that was easier to handle than the actual one. He had not said anything explicit. He had not been cruel. He had just, gradually and consistently, responded better to the Vivian who agreed than to the Vivian who pushed back. And Vivian had noticed this and made the calculation and ended it on a Saturday morning over breakfast without drama. And he had seemed, honestly, somewhat relieved, and that had been its own specific kind of damage. Since then, she had been careful. Not celibate, not isolated, but careful, choosing situations with clear parameters, keeping the kind of emotional investment that she could audit and adjust. This had worked fine. She had built a company. She had made something. She was good at her life. Then she had moved into an apartment on Clement Street with a single father and his 6-year-old daughter and a coffee maker that apparently had always been slightly unstable, and 11 months later here she was. The fear that lived in her specific room was, what if he sees all of me and finds the version of me that's harder to handle? Not the CEO, not the composed woman at his grandmother's dinner table, the version that got quietly furious when things were inefficient in ways they didn't need to be. The version that had real opinions about how other people's companies were run and sometimes couldn't stop herself from saying so. The version that went into her room for 20 minutes after bad calls because she needed to process things alone and had never been apologetic about that. And also the version that sometimes, in the late part of evenings, felt a loneliness she couldn't quite explain given that her life was full and functional and largely going well. Mason had seen most of this already. That was the terrifying part. He had seen it without comment and without adjustment, and without, as far as she could tell, finding it particularly alarming. But seeing something from the comfortable position of roommate and seeing it from the closer position of person who matters were not the same thing. She had learned this before. People had a different tolerance for the difficult parts of someone they loved casually than for the difficult parts of someone they were actually in it with. She was thinking about this on Thursday afternoon when she came home from the office earlier than expected. The afternoon meeting had been rescheduled, and found Mason in the kitchen on the phone standing at the counter with his back to the door, saying, "She's scared too. I know she is." She stood in the hallway for 1 second. Then she set her bag down quietly on the console table and went to her room. She sat on the edge of her bed. She could still faintly hear his voice through the wall, not the words, just the cadence of it. The way he talked when he was being honest, which was different from the way he talked in casual conversation, slower and more considered. She's scared too. I know she is, the fact that he knew. The fact that he had said it to whoever he was talking to, said it plainly, without making it into something he needed to fix or something she needed to perform differently. Just, she's scared too, like it was a fact he had filed and was holding carefully. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes for a moment. Then she got up and changed out of her work clothes and went to the kitchen. He was off the phone by then, standing at the counter reading something on his tablet, and he looked up when she came in. "You're early." Meeting moved. She opened the refrigerator, not because she needed anything, but because she needed a moment. "Who were you talking to?" "Clara." "Your sister?" "Yeah." He set the tablet down. She wanted to hear about the dinner. Vivian stood with the refrigerator open, looking at its contents without seeing them. "What did she say?" "That I should probably be talking to you instead of her." She closed the refrigerator. She turned around and leaned against it, arms crossed, looking at him across the kitchen. "I heard you," she said. "Just a little. Through the wall." Mason held her gaze. "Okay?" "You said I was scared." "You are." "I am," she agreed. "What are you scared of?" He was quiet for a moment, and the way she'd learned meant he was actually deciding what to say rather than stalling. "Getting it wrong with someone who already has the full picture," he said. There's no period where you see a version of me. You have the whole thing. The bad cooking and the not replacing light bulbs and the way I went a year not saying something I should have said. You have all of it, and I don't know what you do with that." I do the same thing I've been doing, she said. You've had the full picture of me too. I know. And I'm still here. I know that too. She unfolded her arms. Mason, I've spent 2 years being careful about not wanting too much. I'm aware of that. I'm aware that I've been... She looked at the window, gathering the sentence. I've been managing, keeping things in a range I could control. And then I moved in here, and 6 months in I realized I'd completely stopped managing, and I didn't notice until it had already happened, and by then you were just... She looked back at him. Part of how my day worked, part of how things made sense. And I didn't know how to put that back in a manageable range, so I just let it be what it was and told myself that was enough. Was it? She looked at him for a moment. No, she said. It wasn't enough. It was good, but it wasn't enough. He came around the counter. He didn't cross the whole kitchen, just moved out from behind it, and stood in the open space between them. Then let's try not managing, he said, both of us, and see what that's like. That's not a plan. No, but you said you were good at deciding things on purpose. He paused. Maybe just decide. She looked at him, and she thought about the conference room 6 years ago, the moment of I might not be enough, and then the choice. The specific internal place where she had turned something from a question into a fact. She had made that choice about her company, about her work, about a dozen things since. She had never made it about a person. She crossed the kitchen. She did not stop at a careful distance. She walked up to him and put her hand on the front of his shirt, not pulling, just resting, and looked up at him. He was looking at her like a man who had finally stopped pretending he wasn't looking. Okay, she said. I'm deciding. He kissed her. Not dramatically, not the movie version. He kissed her the way she might have expected if she'd thought about it, which she had, a little, more than once, always filed under that's not a useful thing to think about. It was careful at first, which was very him, and then it was less careful, which was also very him, and she had her hand in his shirt, and his hands were at her face, and the kitchen smelled like coffee and whatever he'd been heating for lunch, and the afternoon light was coming in sideways through the window. When they stopped, she kept her forehead against his for a moment. She could feel him breathing. Okay, he said quietly. Okay, she said. He laughed, a small sound slightly undone. I've been not doing that for 8 months. I know, I could tell. She pulled back enough to look at him. You're not subtle, Mason. I was extremely subtle. You were not even a little subtle. You saved me the good leftovers every single time. He looked mildly wounded. That's just being a decent roommate. You started saving them before I ever told you they were my favorites. He didn't have an answer for that. She felt the laugh before she heard it, his whole chest moving, and then she was laughing too, and they stood in the kitchen laughing like two people who had been holding something at arm's length for a long time and had finally just set it down. Lily came home from school that afternoon and walked into a kitchen where both adults were at the table with coffee and the leftover half of a cheese Danish that they were sharing, which was not unusual, and which Lily gave a single assessing look before determining that it posed no interesting questions for a 6-year-old and asking if she could have a piece. Half, Mason said. Lily took slightly more than half and went to the living room. This was also not unusual. Children, Mason had found, were often accurate sensors for the atmosphere of a room. They picked up tension faster than any adult, but they were correspondingly unbothered by warmth. Warmth was the normal setting as far as Lily was concerned. This had always been warm. The fact that it was warm in a slightly different way did not register as data that needed processing. She came back to the doorway 20 minutes later. Vivi, can you help me with my spelling words? Vivian looked up from her laptop. After I finish this email. How long's the email? 4 more sentences. Lily went and sat on the counter to wait, eating the last of her Danish, and Vivian finished the email in approximately 3 minutes and closed the laptop and said, Okay, get your notebook. Mason watched them from the table. Lily with her spelling notebook. Vivian going through the words with the same focused attention she brought to client briefs, correcting Lily's pronunciation of necessary 3 times with increasing specificity until Lily got it exactly right and looked up with the expression of someone who had conquered something. Again, Vivian said. Necessary, Lily said correctly. Good. Next one. This was not new behavior. Vivian had helped Lily with homework before, had read with her before, had showed up to 2 school events in the past year because Mason's schedule had conflicted and Vivian had simply said, "I can go," and gone. What was new was the way Mason watched it now, the way he let himself see it without putting it in a box. Lily finished her spelling words and went to do whatever she did in her room in the afternoons, and Vivian came back to the table and picked up her coffee and found Mason looking at her. "What?" she said. "Nothing." "You keep saying nothing and making the face." "What face?" She showed him. It was a decent approximation of the face he'd apparently been making, a kind of quiet, involuntary openness, the look of a person whose defenses had stopped running. He probably should have found it embarrassing. He didn't, particularly. "I'm going to get that on my face more often now," he said. She looked at him, then she looked at her coffee. "Probably," she said, and the word was small and honest and not trying to be anything else. The next 10 days were not a transformation. Mason had half expected some kind of internal shift in the texture of things, but what happened instead was a gradual, undramatic deepening of what had already been there. They still argued about the grocery list. The coffee maker was replaced, reluctantly, by Mason, who had tried to fix the crack with kitchen epoxy, and Vivian had watched this attempt with the expression of someone counting down from 10. He bought a new one on a Saturday, and she did not say "I told you so," which he recognized as an act of genuine restraint and appreciated accordingly. She told him things about her work that she hadn't told him before, not the surface summary but the underneath of it, the part where she'd made a decision she wasn't sure was right, the part where she was managing 2 people on her team whose dynamic was deteriorating and she didn't know yet whether to address it directly or let it resolve. He listened and asked questions and occasionally said things that were wrong, and she told him they were wrong, and they argued about it, and twice she said, "Okay, that's actually a fair point," which he understood was significant. He told her things he hadn't told her, the version of the Renee situation that he hadn't given anyone in its complete form. The part where he'd known things were ending about 4 months before they actually ended, and had spent those 4 months not naming it because naming it made it real. She listened to this without performing empathy, which was its own kind of kindness. She didn't say that must have been so hard. She said, "What would you have done differently?" "Said something earlier," he said. "Why didn't you?" "Same reason you kept things in a manageable range." She had looked at him for a moment. "We have the same problem." "Different rooms," he said. "Same house." She had almost smiled at that. "That's actually quite good. I have my moments." The moments, as it turned out, were more frequent than Mason had given himself credit for. Vivian had a way of receiving them, a small acknowledgement, a look. Occasionally the actual laugh that she didn't perform for audiences, but that happened involuntarily when something genuinely caught her, that made him want to keep producing them, not for approval, but for the specific pleasure of the response. He had not felt that kind of wanting to make someone laugh in a long time. It was a specific good thing. On the Thursday of the second week, his mother called again. She had spoken to Eleanor, who was, as predicted, satisfied in the deep and total way that Eleanor Reed was satisfied by things she had already decided were true. His mother reported this with the small pride of someone who had facilitated something without quite understanding how. "Eleanor said she knew," his mother reported, "from the first time you mentioned her name. She said she could tell from the way you didn't explain things." Mason was in the hallway with his back against the wall, Vivian visible through the open bedroom door, on her laptop, not paying attention to him. He watched her for a second. "Grandma's been right about most things for 80 years, he said. "I should probably have listened sooner." "You read men," his mother said, with a fondness that was also slightly exasperated. "You all take too long. You married one of us." "Exactly," she said. "I know what I'm talking about." He laughed. She laughed. It was the easiest conversation he'd had with his mother in longer than he wanted to calculate, and when he hung up, he stood in the hallway for a moment and felt the absence of the particular weight he had been carrying, the one he had gotten so accustomed to that he had stopped naming it as weight. Vivian looked up from her laptop. "Your mom?" "Yeah." "Everything okay?" "Yeah." He pushed off the wall. "She said Eleanor knew from the beginning." From the first time I said your name. Vivian was quiet for a moment. What do you think she heard? He thought about it honestly. That I wasn't explaining you, he said. I just said your name. Like you were already a fact. She held his gaze, and in her face was the thing he had been learning to read in the past 2 weeks. The thing she didn't perform, didn't manage, the unguarded version that showed up in the in-between moments when she'd stopped deciding what to show. It was the version of Vivian Cross that the conference room didn't see, and the clients didn't see, and possibly nobody had seen in a long time. It looked a lot like someone who had stopped being afraid of being seen. I'm going to make dinner, he said. You're going to put too much salt in it. Probably. I'll fix it when you're not looking. You've been doing that for months, haven't you? She looked back at her screen. I have no idea what you're talking about. He went to the kitchen. He was not a man who had believed in the idea of things falling into place. He had believed in systems and maintenance and careful management of variables. He had needed to, as a single father, as someone who had learned the hard way that unmanaged variables had consequences. But standing in the kitchen, oversalting pasta that would somehow still taste fine, listening to Vivian's laptop keys in the next room and Lily's murmur of some game she was playing and the city outside the window doing its regular indifferent evening thing, Mason understood that what had happened here was not things falling into place. It was something slower, something that had been building in increments so small that he'd been able to ignore them individually and had been choosing to, and had finally accumulated into something too large to look past. That was its own kind of luck, he thought, the kind you didn't see coming because you'd been looking the wrong direction. He tasted the pasta. Too much salt. He was going to have to actually learn to fix this at some point, because Vivian quietly adjusting his cooking when he wasn't looking was something he could let go on for a while, but probably not forever. He would learn. He was capable of learning things. He had, as it turned out, been learning things for 11 months without fully recognizing the curriculum. He turned down the heat and went to the doorway. Lily, he called. Dinner in 10. Okay, came from the end of the hall. He looked at Vivian. She had her chin in her hand and was reading something on her screen with the focused frown she wore when the content was dense, and she did not look up, but she said, without looking up, 10 minutes is not enough time to fix the salt situation. I'm working on it. You always say that. I mean it this time. She looked up then. The frown cleared. She looked at him across the apartment in the early evening light, with his 2 salty pasta and his kid down the hall and his whole regular life laid out around him, and she said, okay, like she believed him. He went back to the kitchen. He actually tried to fix the salt. It did not fully work, but it was better than usual, and when they sat down to eat, no one said anything about it. They ate and talked about Lily's day and Vivian's afternoon meeting and some television show Lily had opinions about, and the evening went on, ordinary and intact, and theirs. 3 weeks after Eleanor Reed's birthday dinner, Vivian got a call on a Tuesday morning that rearranged the rest of her month. She was in her home office when it came in. Door mostly closed, the way it was when she was in work mode. The signal Mason and Lily had both learned without being told. Mason was at the kitchen table with his laptop, doing his own work, and he heard the call start in the normal register of her business voice and then go quiet, which was the specific quiet of someone receiving information they needed to process before responding to. He did not listen. He went back to his project report. 20 minutes later, Vivian came out of her office and stood in the kitchen doorway in the focused frown expression, the one that meant the content was dense. I have to go to New York, she said. Mason looked up. When? Thursday. Possibly for 2 weeks. She leaned against the door frame. Hargrove Media wants to negotiate the contract in person. The creative director is flying in from London. They want a full presentation of the revised scope, and they want it before the end of the month. Hargrove Media was the name she had mentioned twice in passing. The contract that, if it came through at the scale they were discussing, would be the largest single project Cross Design had ever taken on. Mason understood this without needing the full context. He had been paying attention for 11 months. 2 weeks, he said. Maybe less. Depends on how the negotiation goes. She crossed her arms. I hate New York in November. What do you need before you go? She looked at him. This was still relatively new, the fact of him asking that question and meaning the full scope of it, not just the logistical surface. She had noticed that he asked it differently now than he would have asked it 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks ago, it would have been a roommate question. Now it was something else. I don't know yet, she said honestly. I need to build the revised presentation. I need to call my team lead. I need to figure out what I'm leaving running without me and what I'm taking with me. She paused. I need coffee. The new coffee maker still doesn't feel like mine yet. It makes the same coffee. It makes different coffee. I don't expect you to understand that. He got up and made her coffee without argument, and she sat at the kitchen table across from where he'd been working and pulled up her email. And they worked in the same room the way they often did, parallel and quiet, occasionally saying something, and Mason thought about 2 weeks and tried to identify what the feeling was, and found, without much surprise, that it was simply, I'm going to miss her. He had missed people before. He had missed his grandmother when she'd gotten older and the visits became less frequent. He had missed his sister when she moved to Portland. Missing someone as a general category was not new to him. But this was a specific missing in advance, the particular awareness of an absence before it happened. And it had a quality that told him, if he'd needed any more telling, that whatever this was had moved well past the range of manageable. He did not say any of this. He went back to his project report. The 2 days before she left were full in the way that pre-departure days were always full. Her team in and out of her office on video calls, her home desk covered in printed materials and annotated drafts, the apartment running at a different frequency than its usual settled hum. Lily could sense it. She came home from school on Wednesday and walked through the apartment with the careful attention of a child taking stock. And when she found Vivian at her desk, she stood in the doorway and said, "Are you going somewhere?" Vivian looked up. "New York, for work. I'll be back in less than 2 weeks." Lily processed this. "That's far." "It's a plane ride. Not that far." "Have you been there before?" "Many times." "What's it like?" Vivian considered this seriously. "Loud," she said, "and the pizza is better than here, but don't tell your dad I said that." Lily absorbed this information and departed. Mason, who had been within earshot in the hallway, did not comment on the pizza claim, though he intended to revisit it at a later date. That evening, Lily wanted Vivian to do the bedtime story, which she'd asked for with increasing frequency over the past month, and Mason sat on the edge of Lily's bed and watched Vivian sit in the reading chair with the chapter book they'd been working through. A story about a girl and a lighthouse and a series of mysteries that Lily found deeply satisfying. And he watched Lily fight sleep the way she always did, losing ground incrementally until her eyes were half closed and her breathing had gone slow, and Vivian finished the chapter and closed the book and set it quietly on the nightstand. She looked at Lily for a moment, just looked, with an expression that she wasn't monitoring. Mason saw it. He looked away before she looked up. In the hallway, she said quietly, "She's going to be fine while I'm gone." "I know that. I'm not worried about—" She stopped. "I'm not sure what I'm saying." He did know. She had been settled into this life, their life, the apartment life, the Lily in the reading chair life. And going to New York to negotiate the biggest contract of her company's existence was, professionally, what she had been building toward for 6 years. And it was also an interruption of something she hadn't known she needed until recently. And both of those things were true at the same time. And that was uncomfortable in a way that didn't have a clean solution. "You're going to win the contract," he said. "I don't know that. You rewrote an entire presentation on a hunch once, and it worked. You've had 3 weeks on this one." She looked at him in the half-dark of the hallway. "That's actually a fair characterization. I have my moments." She moved toward him, and he met her in the middle of the hallway, and she put her arms around him in the matter-of-fact way she had. Not performing affection, but using it, choosing it, which was more than performance. And he held on, and they stood there for a moment in Lily's doorway, with the nightlight visible inside and the rest of the apartment quiet. 2 weeks, she said into his shoulder. "Less," he said. "You said less. Probably less. Go get the contract." She pulled back and looked at him. "Don't eat pasta every night." "I have other recipes." "Name one that isn't pasta." He thought about it. I can do eggs. Mason. There are a lot of things you can do with eggs. Omelets, scrambled, fried. I'm going to come home to 2 people who have eaten eggs for 12 days. We'll be fine. She looked at him for another moment, and then she kissed him, brief and direct, and went to her room. Mason stood in the hallway for a moment. Then he went and turned off the kitchen light that he'd left on, and he thought, less than 2 weeks, and went to bed. She left Thursday morning before Lily was up. The cab was coming at 6 and her flight was at 8:30, and Mason had set an alarm for 5:45 even though he didn't need to, and he was in the kitchen with coffee when she came out of her room with her bag, coat over her arm, already composed in the way she was when she'd shifted into work mode. The CEO setting, he thought of it, the particular arrangement of her face that was ready for the day, whatever the day required. She stopped in the kitchen. You didn't have to get up. I know. She picked up the coffee he'd left on the counter. She drank half of it standing at the counter and looked out the window at the dark street below. And he looked at her in the kitchen light and felt the ordinary, extraordinary strangeness of caring about someone. The way it turned normal mornings into something with weight. Text me when you land, he said. I always have my phone. Vivian, I'll text you. The cab notification came on her phone. She put the cup down and picked up her bag and her coat, and Mason walked her to the door, and she turned there and looked at him with the expression that was hers, the unguarded version, the one that appeared in the in-between spaces of her life, and she said, behave, which he understood meant, I'll miss you too. Go, he said. She went. The apartment was loud in her absence in the way only quiet places could be. Lily noticed on the first day. She came home from school and walked through the apartment with the same stock-taking attention as before, and when she found Mason at the kitchen table, she stood across from him and said, It feels different. Vivian's in New York, Mason said. I know, but it feels different. She thought about it. Like when Mrs. Kim went to visit her daughter and the building felt different. Buildings don't feel different. Yes, they do, Lily said, with the certainty of someone who had not yet been talked out of her accurate perceptions by adults. She got herself a glass of water and went to the living room, apparently finished with the subject. Mason looked at the kitchen. She was not wrong. The apartment did feel different. The home office door was open. Vivian always closed it when she was working, always opened it when she was done, and it was open now because she was not here to close it. And that open door had a particular quality, like a sentence that had been left unfinished. He called her that evening, the first time. She was at the hotel, ordered room service. The Hargrove meeting was tomorrow afternoon, and she was going through the presentation deck one more time because she'd found a transition slide that bothered her. Which slide? He asked. 14, the scope breakdown. It's too detailed for that point in the presentation. It front-loads complexity when I want them still in the feeling of the concept. Then move it. I know I should move it. I'm deciding where to move it to. Slide 19, after the team credentials. They'll be more receptive to complexity after they trust the team. Silence. That's actually correct, she said. I told you, I have my moments. You have more moments than you give yourself credit for, she said, which was not a thing she would have said 3 months ago, not because it wasn't true then, but because they hadn't been in the place where she would say it. The fact that she said it now, plainly, without making a thing of it, landed in him quietly and stayed. They talked for 40 minutes. Lily came and said goodnight to the phone. Vivian told her to sleep and that she'd be home soon. And Lily accepted this and went to bed without argument, which was unusual enough that Mason mentioned it after. She's easy, Vivian said. She's usually not that easy at bedtime. She was for me. He'd noticed this, had been noticing it for months, the way Lily's particular frequency had calibrated to Vivian's. He didn't entirely understand the mechanics of it. Lily's instincts about people had always been good, better than his own, and she had decided within the first 20 minutes of knowing Vivian that Vivian was safe and interesting, and had organized herself accordingly. Whatever Vivian said landed differently with Lily than the same thing said by Mason, not because Mason had less authority, but because they were different frequencies, and Lily had, sensibly, tuned to both. He thought about what that meant for the longer term, after he hung up. He had been careful about not thinking too far forward. He was still, in some ways, a person who had learned the consequences of unmanaged variables. But the longer term was unavoidable when a 6-year-old was drawing pictures with 3 people in them and calling them family. He needed to be honest about what he was building, not just what he was feeling. The Hargrove meeting on Friday went long. He knew this because Vivian didn't text until 7 p.m. Eastern, which was 4 p.m. his time, and the text said, "Still in it. Creative director has opinions. More later." And then, 90 minutes later, "Still in it." And then at 9 p.m. Eastern, "Done. Call when Lily's down." He called at 9:30 his time. "Tell me," he said. "The creative director has a vision problem," she said, and her voice had the specific flatness of someone who had been professionally diplomatic for 6 hours and had run out of diplomatic. Not in the medical sense, in the sense that his vision for the project and the actual project budget exist in different realities, and he has not reconciled them, and my job today was apparently to be the person who introduced that reconciliation. How did that go? He didn't like it. Did the deal survive it? Yes? A pause. He's a creative. He has good instincts, and he's used to getting what he wants, and he needed someone to tell him which of the things he wants he can actually have. That's not complicated, it's just unpleasant. Another pause. He'll come around. The lead from the Hargrove side wants this project, and she wants it with us. She managed him through the last hour. So it's good. It's on track. He could hear her moving, the sound of her in the hotel room, probably still in work clothes, probably with her shoes already off. There's a working dinner Monday and a final terms meeting Wednesday. If Wednesday goes the way Friday almost went, I'll probably stay through Thursday. But you're back by the weekend. Yes, I'm back by the weekend. He exhaled, not loudly. Good. How's Lily? Fine. She declared this morning that she's going to be an architect. That's new. She saw a building on a show she was watching and decided. Previous career options have included marine biologist, dog trainer, and a person who specifically makes birthday cakes. All reasonable. I think so too. He leaned back on the couch. What are you doing tonight? Ordering the second thing I actually want for room service, instead of the sensible thing, and going to sleep. What's the second thing? Cheese fries and a club sandwich. That's not dinner, that's a sports bar at 2 a.m. I've been in a negotiation for 6 hours, Mason. I've earned the cheese fries. I'm not arguing with the cheese fries, I'm just identifying them accurately. She laughed, and the laugh was tired, but it was real, the involuntary one, and he felt it through the phone like something physical. Get some sleep, he said. You too. A pause. Thank you for the slide 19 thing. Told you. Don't get smug about it. Little bit smug. Good night, Mason. Good night, Viv. He put the phone down. He looked at the ceiling. The apartment was quiet in the way it had been quiet since Thursday morning, and he thought about how specific and irreplaceable a person's presence was. Not just the talking, but the ambient fact of them, the way a space organized itself differently when they were in it. He was 40 minutes into this thought when his phone buzzed. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer it. He answered it. Mason Reed? A woman's voice, professional and brisk. Yeah. I'm calling from St. Mark's Elementary. I'm the after-school coordinator. We have a Lily Reed here who was supposed to be picked up at 4. We've been trying to reach you. Mason sat up. What? She goes to Mrs. Kim's on Fridays. We have no record of an alternate pickup today. The student has been here since 4:15. We were able to reach you now. He was already standing. I'm coming. 15 minutes. He hung up and grabbed his keys and his jacket and stood in the hallway for exactly 2 seconds, calling himself every kind of idiot because he had changed Lily's pickup arrangement 2 weeks ago for a different reason and had completely failed to update the school calendar, which Mrs. Kim knew about because he had told Mrs. Kim and had not told the school, and this was exactly the kind of variable management failure he was supposed to be good at preventing. He got Lily within 12 minutes. She was sitting in the coordinator's office eating a small bag of crackers that the staff had provided, not visibly distressed, just waiting with the particular patience of a child who had long experience with her father's logistical shortcomings. Hi, Bug. Hi. She stood up and took his hand. I waited. I know. I'm sorry. I messed up the schedule. It's okay. She considered. Mrs. Kim didn't come either. My fault. I didn't tell the school. He signed the form the coordinator placed in front of him and thanked the staff and took Lily out to the car, and she got in and put on her seatbelt and said, without accusation, "You should put things in the calendar." "You're right. Vivi puts everything in the calendar. I know she does. She showed me. She has a whole color system." "I'm aware of the color system." Lily looked out the window. "Maybe she can show you." He drove. Outside, the city moved at its regular Friday evening pace, indifferent to the small internal reckonings of one imperfect father who was doing better than he sometimes gave himself credit for, and worse than he intended in ways that were mostly fixable. "She'll show me," he said. "When she gets back." "When is she getting back?" "By the weekend. Maybe Thursday." "That's soon," Lily said with satisfaction. "Yeah," he said. "That's soon." The working dinner on Monday was followed by a Tuesday call Vivian had not anticipated. A conference with the London creative director and 3 members of his team that lasted 4 hours, and which she described afterward with the contained fury of someone who had won something and still found the winning exhausting. "He came around," she said. "Took until hour 3, but he came around. He's actually good when he stops protecting his own vision long enough to look at what the project needs." "You like him," Mason said. "I respect him professionally. That's different." "You like him a little." A pause. "He has good instincts, and he stopped arguing once I laid out the numbers in a way he couldn't reframe. I respect people who stop arguing when the evidence changes." "That's your version of liking someone." "Don't push it, Reed." He smiled at the ceiling. It was late his time, Lily already asleep, the apartment in its nighttime quiet. He had gotten better, across the week, at the absence. Not comfortable with it, but functional within it, which was probably more honest anyway. Comfort with absence was a thing you learned by not wanting the person back, and he wanted her back, which meant the adjustment was always going to be partial. "Wednesday," he said. "Final terms." "Wednesday," she confirmed. "It should be straightforward. The framework is agreed. Wednesday is paperwork and handshakes. And then you come home." She was quiet for a moment. "Thursday flight. I'll be back by 3. "I'll make dinner." "Mason." "Something that isn't pasta and isn't eggs. I've been researching." "You've been researching recipes?" "I watched 4 videos." Another pause. "What did you land on?" "Roast chicken. It's apparently not as hard as it looks, and the salt goes in a place where it can't ruin anything." She was quiet for a moment longer than usual, and then she said, "Okay," in the voice that meant something more than the word itself, and he understood it and sat with it, and the line was quiet between them in the easy way that silences between people who knew each other could be. "The presentation slide thing," she said. "I've been thinking about that, about the fact that you knew to move it to 19 without seeing the deck. I've been listening to you work for a year. I know, that's what I've been thinking about." A pause. "You paid attention without making me feel observed. That's—" She stopped. "That's not nothing. Most people can't do that." He didn't say anything for a moment. Outside his window, a siren passed and faded. "You made 2 cups of coffee," he said, "by month 3. You didn't ask? You just made 2. I noticed that before I noticed most other things." She was quiet. "Some things just register," he said, "because they matter to you." She made a small sound that was not quite agreement and not quite deflection, but somewhere between them, the sound she made when something landed and she wasn't sure yet what to do with it. He had learned to give those moments room. "Sleep," he said. "Wednesday is a big day." "I know." "You already won it. Wednesday is just paperwork." "You don't know that." "I know your track record." "Go to bed, Mason." "Good night, Vivian." "Good night." Nat. Wednesday went well. She texted him at 2 p.m. New York time. Done. Flying home tomorrow. He texted back, chicken's already thawing. She texted, "You bought a whole chicken, 4 videos. I know what I'm doing. You absolutely do not know what you're doing. I watched a 5th video this morning. I'm very prepared." A pause. Then, See you tomorrow. He put the phone down and looked at the chicken defrosting on the counter and thought about 11 months in kitchen light and the way a person could be the most important thing in your daily life for a long time before you allowed yourself to know it. He thought about the open door of her office all week, the three people drawing on the refrigerator Lily's unimpeachable instincts. He thought about his grandmother on the porch, and his sister on the phone, and his own face in the hallway mirror that morning, which looked, honestly, like the face of a man who had stopped bracing. He called Clara. She got the contract, he said. I heard, Clara said. She texted me. He stopped. She texted you. We've been texting for 2 weeks. She wanted to know what you were like as a kid. I told her everything. Clara, the time you cried at the dog movie, the haircut in 8th grade, Clara. She deserves the full picture, Mason. You said so yourself. He sat down at the kitchen table. Outside the window, the city was doing its November afternoon thing, gray and cool and entirely itself. He looked at the chicken. He looked at the refrigerator, where Lily's drawing had been joined sometime in the past week by a second drawing. This one, he now noticed, showing 3 people in a building that was probably meant to be their apartment, with a yellow door that their apartment did not actually have, but which Lily had apparently decided it should. He looked at it for a moment. She's coming home tomorrow, he said. I know, Clara said. Are you going to say it? Say what? The thing you haven't said yet, that you probably should say. He was quiet. Mason, his sister said, not unkindly, you've been getting it right for a year. Stop treating it like an exam you might fail. He looked at the yellow door in Lily's drawing. He thought about the woman who had answered a Craigslist ad with 2 questions and shaken his hand like a business deal and knelt down to look at Lily's horse drawing and said, The legs look right. I know what I'm doing, he said. Clara paused. Is that what you're going to say to her? No, he said, but I know. The chicken thawed on the counter. Thursday was coming. He had 4 videos worth of preparation and a 5th one he'd watched twice, and the absolute conviction that what he was building, not just the dinner, not just the evening, but the longer architecture of this thing, was worth doing right. He got up and went to find the roasting pan. She landed at 2:47. Mason knew this because she texted him from the gate, on ground, bag to claim. And he was standing in the kitchen with the chicken in the oven and 45 minutes left on the timer, and Lily at the kitchen table doing homework with the focused intensity of someone who had been told that if the homework was done before Vivian got home, there would be dessert. The apartment smelled like something he had actually cooked. This was new. The 5 videos had delivered, at least so far, on the fundamental promise that a whole chicken was not technically complicated, just time-sensitive. And Mason had decided that time-sensitive he could manage because he was a project manager, and time was his professional domain, even if salt was apparently not. Lily looked up from her worksheet. Is that food? It's dinner. It smells like real dinner. All my dinners are real dinners. They smell like pasta, Lily said. This smells like when Mrs. Kim cooks. Mason chose not to engage further with this and checked the oven. Vivian texted again at 3:20. Cab, 20 minutes. He texted back. Timer has 18 minutes. Suspenseful. Do not let it burn. I have it under control. Mason. I have it almost under control. I'm getting out of the cab and walking. He turned the oven down 4 degrees, which the 5th video had mentioned as a finishing technique, and he felt, not for the first time this week, the particular absurdity and also the complete seriousness of caring about a thing because someone else was coming home to it. The door opened at 3:41. Lily heard it first. She had the hearing of a person who was very motivated. And she was off the chair and in the hallway before Mason had fully registered the sound of the key. He heard the collision of a 6-year-old and a rolling suitcase, and Vivian's voice saying, Hey, let me get through the door. And then the lower sound of her actually holding on, the coat and the bag and the 6-year-old all present simultaneously. Mason came to the hallway. Vivian looked up from where she was crouched with Lily. She was still in her travel clothes, dark coat, work bag over one shoulder, the composed set of her face that she wore in transit, and she looked tired the way people looked after 2 weeks of being professionally on. And she looked at him over Lily's head with an expression that was simply, I'm back. Hi, he said. Hi. She stood up, one hand still on Lily's shoulder. She looked around the apartment and then back at him. It smells like you actually cooked something. Roast chicken. From the videos. From the videos. She looked at him for a moment with the expression he had learned to read, the one that happened when something landed and she let it instead of filing it away. Then she said, "Let me put my bag down." Dinner was not perfect. The chicken was slightly overcooked on one side, which Mason identified immediately, and Vivian did not comment on, and one of the vegetables he'd roasted alongside it had gone too soft, and Lily knocked over her water glass in the first 10 minutes, and they spent 4 minutes dealing with that, and then everything resumed. They ate and talked about New York. Vivian told Lily about the hotel and the skyline and the pizza claim, which she defended with specifics while Mason disputed with equal specifics, and Lily listened to this as though it were a sporting event. And they talked about Lily's week and the spelling test she'd gotten an 8 out of 10 on, and the 2 she'd gotten wrong, which she was still bothered by. "Necessary," Vivian said. "You knew that one." "I knew it at home," Lily said. "I forgot it at school." "That's what practice is for, so it's automatic, not just something you know when it's comfortable." Lily considered this with the seriousness she gave things that Vivian said. "Can we practice again?" "After dinner." They ate. Mason watched the two of them across the table and felt the thing he'd been feeling all week in its absence, the specific, irreplaceable quality of this. And he thought about what his sister had said. "You've been getting it right for a year." He thought about Lily's drawing with the yellow door. He thought about his grandmother's voice on the porch. There is a kind of fear that looks a lot like caution. He had been cautious for a long time. He had good reasons. The reasons were not gone. Lily was still 6, still counting on the system to hold, still the first and most important variable in any decision he made about his life. That had not changed. That would not change. But he had spent so long using that responsibility as a reason to stay still that he had confused stillness with safety, and they were not the same thing. Stillness was just stillness. Safety was something you built, not something you preserved by not moving. After dinner, Lily did spelling words with Vivian in the living room while Mason cleaned up, and he listened to the back and forth of it. Vivian's voice, then Lily's, the correction, the repetition, the small sound of approval when Lily got it right. And he thought, this is what I was afraid of losing, not the category of it. This. Specifically this, these two people in the next room, this kitchen, this evening. And the thing was, the thing he had finally gotten clear on, across the week of chicken thawing and recipe videos and late phone calls, was that you did not protect something like this by keeping it at arm's length. You protected it by choosing it, deliberately, every day, imperfectly, with full knowledge of the ways it could go wrong and the decision to stay anyway. That was not caution. That was just honesty. Lily went to bed at 8:30. Vivian did the story, the chapter book, the same ritual, and Mason listened from the hallway to the familiar shapes of it, the reading voice, the page turning, the moment when Lily's questions stopped coming because she was finally going under. When Vivian came out and pulled Lily's door to its usual not quite closed position, she found Mason still in the hallway, leaning against the wall. "She was out fast," Vivian said quietly. "She missed you," he said. "She doesn't sleep as easily when the routine is off." Vivian looked at the door for a moment. She did not say anything, but her hand stayed on the door frame briefly, a small thing, the kind of thing you only noticed if you were paying the right kind of attention. They went to the kitchen. Mason made tea, something he had taken up in the past week in the absence of the coffee maker being used by anyone else, which had been its own small revelation about habit and proximity. And they sat at the table the way they had sat at it 100 times, and the kitchen was exactly as it had always been, and also everything had moved. "Tell me the real version," he said. "Not the summary, the actual version of the 2 weeks." She looked at him. Then she picked up the mug and held it, and started talking, and the real version was longer and more complicated than any of the phone call summaries. The way the creative director had made her feel, in hour 2 of the first meeting, that she was being managed rather than heard. The specific moment where she had decided to stop being diplomatic and just lay out the numbers and accept whatever came from that. The uncertainty on Sunday night, not about the deal, but about herself. The particular 2 a.m. question of whether she had built something real or something that looked real from the outside. The way the Hargrove lead had said, on Wednesday after the final signatures, "You're the best in the room and you knew it, that's why this worked," and how Vivienne had thanked her and meant it and also not entirely believed it, which was the honest version of how compliments landed when you had spent a long time being the person who built things, while other people evaluated whether the things were good enough. Mason listened to all of it. He did not fix any of it. He asked 2 questions, both of which were about what she'd felt rather than what had happened, and he waited for the answers. And when she was done, she looked at him across the table with the look that meant she had said more than she'd planned to and was taking stock of that. "You're good at this," she said. "Listening? Not making it smaller." She turned the mug. "Some people listen, and you can feel them waiting to resolve it. You just let it be the size it is." "You do the same thing," he said. "You did it with the Renee stuff. You didn't try to put it anywhere." She nodded slowly. Outside, the street was doing its late Thursday thing, occasional car, occasional voice, the building settling into its own sounds. The kitchen light was the steady, non-flickering version now, and the coffee maker was the new one that Vivienne still said made different coffee. And everything in the room was both familiar and newly weighted with the specific significance of things you had almost not let yourself have. "I want to say something," Mason said. She looked at him, waiting, not pushing. "I've been careful for a long time," he said. "You know that. You've watched it for 11 months. And I had reasons. I still have them. Lily's still the first thing I think about in any decision about my life. That's not going to change." He paused. "But I've been using caution as a cover for something that was actually just fear. Fear of getting it wrong again. Fear of what it costs Lily if I get it wrong. And I've been applying that fear to everything, including something that hasn't given me a single reason to be afraid of it." She was very still. "I'm not afraid of this," he said. "I want to be clear about that. I was afraid of wanting it, because wanting things has a cost when they don't work out. But I'm not afraid of you. I'm not afraid of what this is." He looked at her directly. "I don't want to manage it anymore. I don't want to keep it in a range. I want the whole thing, whatever that means for us. And I think you do too, and I think we've both known that for longer than we've been willing to say it." The kitchen was very quiet. Vivienne set her mug down. She looked at the table for a moment, and then she looked at him, and her face had the unguarded quality he had come to think of as the truest version of her. Not the CEO, not the composed woman at the dinner table, but the person who went quiet for 20 minutes after hard calls and came out ready to move, who ate crackers over the sink at 11 at night, who had learned his daughter's spelling words with the seriousness of someone who understood that small things mattered. "I spent 2 weeks in New York," she said, "negotiating the biggest contract my company has ever had, and the thing I thought about most was this kitchen." She said it plainly, without drama. "That's not something I would have admitted 6 months ago. I wouldn't have admitted it to myself, but it's true." She paused. "I've been afraid of being too much. Not too much for you specifically. I think you've been telling me for months that too much is fine, but too much is a general condition. Wanting too much, needing too much, being the version of myself that is difficult and certain and doesn't soften easily and has opinions about other people's slide decks. Slide 19. Don't make me laugh right now. I'm trying to say something." "Sorry." She almost smiled anyway, briefly, and then she was serious again. "I've been afraid that the more you saw, the less you'd want. And you've had everything to see for 11 months, and you're still sitting in this kitchen at 10 at night asking me for the real version of things." She looked at him steadily. "That means something. It means more than I know how to say efficiently." "You don't have to say it efficiently." "I know. That's the other thing I've been learning." She reached across the table and put her hand over his, the same gesture as the first night, the kitchen at midnight, except that now it was not tentative and it was not careful and it was not asking a question. It was just a fact. "I love you," she said. "That's the thing I've been not saying. I love you and I love your daughter, and I love this apartment with its non-flickering kitchen light and its consistently oversalted pasta, and I don't want to manage that. I want it to be what it is." Mason turned his hand over under hers. He held on. "I love you," he said. "I think I have for a while. I think my grandmother knew before I did, which is embarrassing, but accurate. Vivian laughed. The real one. The involuntary one. The laugh that happened when something genuinely caught her. And he felt it the way he always felt it, like something opening. They stayed at the kitchen table for a long time after that, not talking about plans or next steps or what this looked like going forward, just talking the way they talked at their best, following the thread of whatever came up, moving from the Hargrove contract to Clara's apparently ongoing text conversation with Vivian to the question of whether Lily's architect phase would outlast the previous career ambitions to a long tangent about the building across the street that they'd both been curious about for months. The tea went cold. Mason made more. Outside, the city did what it did at all hours, indifferent and continuous. And inside the apartment on Clement Street, two imperfect people sat in the kitchen and talked until nearly midnight, which was later than either of them should have stayed up and exactly as long as it needed to be. There are things that television and movies do not tell you about love that starts this way. The slow accumulation kind, the kind built from proximity and ordinary days rather than a moment or a catalyst. They do not tell you that the foundation is also the complication, that knowing someone this well before you love them means that the love has nowhere to hide and no opportunity to be idealized, which is both the most frightening thing about it and the most durable. Mason Reed was not a man who had been looking for love. He had been looking for stability, for a working system, for a life that held together reliably enough that his daughter could count on it. He had found those things. And then, in the way that life tends to exceed whatever you were planning for, he had found something he hadn't had a category for, a person who fit into the system not by being easy, but by being real, by having her own weight and her own edges and her own 20-minute-in-the-room moments, and staying anyway, and making 2 cups of coffee by month 3 without making it into anything other than a fact. Vivian Cross had spent 6 years building something from a spare bedroom and a laptop and the specific stubbornness of a woman who had decided she was going to be enough even when the room made her feel like a question mark. She was good at building things. She understood, in her bones, that the things worth having were not found but constructed, slowly, with iteration, with the willingness to tear down what wasn't working and rebuild without the ego of the original design. She had applied this to her company. She had not known, until an apartment on Clement Street, that you could apply it to a life. The fake story, the one they'd invented in 4 days of preparation, the breakfast and the deciding, the rehearsed timeline, became, over the following months, a source of genuine entertainment at family gatherings. Mason's cousin Dana brought it up at Christmas with the delighted cruelty of someone who had always suspected something and been proven comprehensively right. Eleanor, when told the original story had been fabricated for the dinner, looked between them for a long moment and then said with complete composure, "The story was fabricated. The rest of it was obvious." She did not appear to find this surprising. She appeared, if anything, to find it mildly beneath her to have the thing she already knew confirmed. Mason's mother cried a little, which she had been hoping not to do, and cried anyway, which was very her. Clara, who had been texting Vivian for 2 months by then, showed up to Christmas with the expression of someone who had been in on the story longer than anyone and had conducted herself with admirable restraint about it, and she and Vivian spent 40 minutes in the kitchen talking in the way of 2 people who had already done the work of becoming friends before they met in person. Lily, when asked what she thought about Vivian and her dad being together, considered the question with her particular 6-year-old gravity and said, "I already knew." And when Mason asked how she'd known, she said, "Because you both looked at each other the same way when you thought the other one wasn't looking." This was delivered with no particular fanfare, the way she delivered most accurate observations, as though the fact of it was self-evident and the only mystery was why adults needed it pointed out. She was not wrong. She had not been wrong from the beginning. Children who have been raised with honesty tend to be better at recognizing it, and Lily Reed had been raised by a father who was imperfect and consistent and who had never in 6 years pretended something was fine when it wasn't. She had calibrated accordingly. The story they told at dinner parties, once there were dinner parties, once there was a version of their life that included those, was the real one, eventually. Not the fabricated timeline, but the actual one. The Craigslist ad, and the 2-question email, and the handshake like a business deal, the horse drawing and the leg comment, 11 months of coffee and salt and cactus socks and late-night kitchen conversations that neither of them had been calling what they were. People always wanted to know when they knew. The specific moment, the catalyst, the turn. Mason always said the birthday dinner. Vivian always said earlier than that, and when pressed, she said the breakfast. Month 2, 5 a.m., sick kid, and the fact that he had just handled it without making it into anything, and she had noticed and filed it without knowing yet what she was filing it under. Mason said, the first time she told this version, "You never told me you noticed that." "You didn't need me to tell you," she said. "You weren't doing it to be noticed. Then how did you—" "Because that's how you know it's real," she said. "When someone does something good and they don't need you to see it." He thought about that for a long time after. He thought about the 2 cups of coffee by month 3. He thought about the slide 19 call from New York and what she'd said about it. "You paid attention without making me feel observed." He thought about the fact that real attention was quiet, that real care did not announce itself, that 11 months of 2 people being genuinely themselves in proximity was a more accurate test of compatibility than any amount of intentional courtship, because you could not sustain a performance for 11 months. Not at 5 a.m., not over the sink at midnight, not in the 20-minute silences after hard calls. What they had seen in each other was not the curated version. It was the Tuesday version, the broken coffee maker version, the too much salt version, the fear dressed up as caution version. And they had kept showing up anyway, for reasons neither of them could have articulated at the time, which was probably the truest definition of what the word meant when you stripped away the romance of it and looked at the actual machinery, etika. The following spring, Lily's school had a parents' event, the kind of thing where you came in and saw the children's work displayed on the walls, the drawings and the writing samples and the projects, and you moved through the room feeling proud and slightly overwhelmed by how much your kid had done that you hadn't known about. Mason and Vivian went together. This was not extraordinary by then. There had been 3 school events since the fall, and they had gone to all of them together, and the other parents had the relaxed incuriosity of people who accepted the configuration in front of them without needing its history. Lily's teacher, a practical woman in her 30s named Ms. Park, had met Vivian at the second event and shaken her hand and said, "Lily talks about you a lot." And Vivian had said, "What does she say?" And Ms. Park had smiled and said, "That you're the best at spelling words." At the spring event, Lily's work was displayed on the 3rd panel from the door. The writing sample was about what her family looked like, a prompt Ms. Park had given the class in January. Lily had written in the careful large letters of a child who took handwriting seriously. "My family is me and my dad and Vivian. My dad makes pasta. Vivian helps with spelling. We live in an apartment with a yellow door. The apartment did not have a yellow door. The apartment had a standard issue brown door that the building management had painted at some point in the 90s and not since." Mason looked at the yellow door statement. He looked at Vivian beside him, reading it. She was reading it with the unguarded expression, the one she did not perform, and her mouth was doing the thing where a smile was present but not announced. "We don't have a yellow door," he said. "I know." "She's been drawing a yellow door for months, on all her drawings." "I know." "Why yellow?" Vivian was quiet for a moment. "I think," she said, "because yellow means something's on the other side of it worth going home to." He looked at the drawing one more time. Then he looked at Vivian, and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything else because neither of them needed to. They moved to the next panel. Lily found them 10 minutes later and pulled them toward a project about weather systems she was particularly proud of, and Mason held her hand and Vivian listened to the weather explanation with genuine attention, and they stood in a school gymnasium in the ordinary spring evening light, imperfect and present and exactly where they were supposed to be. None of it was a story anyone would have invented. It was too slow, too ordinary, too full of broken coffee makers and oversalted pasta and fears that took too long to name. It did not have a moment. It had 11 months of moments, accumulated without permission, adding up to something neither of them had been looking for, and both of them had needed in ways they couldn't have told you when it started. That is probably the only kind of love worth trusting. Not the kind that arrives with certainty, but the kind that builds in the background while you're doing other things. while you're making 2 cups of coffee and saving the good leftovers, and learning someone's rhythms so gradually that by the time you know them, it feels like you always have. The kind that doesn't need a yellow door to know it's home. It just needs 2 people willing to stop pretending they don't know what it is. And sometimes, if you're paying the right kind of attention, that's enough.